Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to explore the Victorian era ideal of womanhood as expressed in John Ruskin's essay Of Queens Gardens, which was published as part of Sesame and Lilies in 1865. Ruskin's text is a classic, traditional, mid-19th century, so Victorian era, statement on the role, duties and supposedly innate characteristics of women, which is what makes it, I think, a really interesting, if also infuriating, text to analyse, especially in terms of providing us with an insight about Victorian era culture. John Ruskin's Of Queens Gardens is, you could say, an exemplar of repressive and oppressive Victorian notions of the female gender, ideal femininity and womanhood, or woman with an A as symbol rather than women with an E as people, women as people, as individuals, each with our own personalities, characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, and so on. This is a really interesting text to consider, I think, when thinking about the gender ideology implicit within the figure of the angel in the house. The angel in the house was a dominant symbol of womanhood in the Victorian era. Now, it was primarily a middle class way of thinking in Britain and in England about the ideal woman, but nevertheless it was pervasive and influential in Victorian culture more broadly. At least in part this is because the publishing industry itself is a middle class industry writing for middle class people, and so obviously its ideas are culture forming because you put forward a text and that goes out into the culture and helps shape the culture. And as I've said, writing is primarily a middle class activity because people who are kind of hard at physical work every day don't necessarily have the time to write about it. So the angel in the house to some extent can be seen as a middle class figure, but culturally pervasive nonetheless. The angel in the house is a useful phrase as it encapsulates two key elements of the ideal Victorian woman: her character and her sphere, her place. So an angel in character and in the house, that's her sphere, that's her place. And I'm going to unpick these in a bit more detail today through John Ruskin's essay Of Queens Gardens. In terms of outlining the lecture today then, I'm going to focus on how John Ruskin uses the idea of binaries. So how he uses binaries to imply difference or, well, opposition, frankly, between the sexes. So I'm going to go through John Ruskin's lecture Of Queens Gardens that considers the, quote, separate characters of man and woman in order to illuminate what the ideal woman or ideal wife was considered to be in the Victorian period, what a woman's role was assumed to be, and the interrelation between woman and home as kind of symbols, the symbols of those two things and how they correlate and interrelate. In other words, how a Victorian woman was to be an angel in the house. Incidentally, the Angel in the House was the title of a long narrative poem which was incredibly popular at the time by Coventry Patmore. It was inspired by Patmore's own wife, Emily, and celebrates womanhood as a state of devotedness, docility, meekness, humility, domesticity, and ideal virtue. The poem The Angel in the House was published in parts between 1854 and 1862, so a current hit when John Ruskin was writing Of Queens Gardens, and indeed Ruskin quotes from Patmore's poem The Angel in the House approvingly within his lecture. Ruskin refers to those lovely lines, I would they were, meaning I wish they were, learned by all the youthful ladies of England. Ruskin quotes Patmore's lines, Ah, wasteful woman, she who may on her sweet self set her own price, knowing he cannot choose but pay. How has she cheapened paradise? How given for naught her priceless gift? How spoiled the bread and spilled the wine, which, spent with due respective thrift, had made brutes men, and men divine. The point here essentially is that women cheapen paradise if they give in to men too wastefully, and that by not being wasteful of themselves, they essentially make men divine. So there's quite a peculiar logic here, which is that women who are wasteful of themselves and don't set a high enough price on themselves cheapen paradise. And by withholding herself from men, she makes men divine. So it's presented here as being kind of women's responsibility to take men from brutes and make them divine. But what there isn't here is any sense that perhaps it's up to the man to make himself divine or behave like a brute, and perhaps it's up to himself to conceive of paradise. No, it's all on the woman. As I go through the text of John Ruskin's Of Queens Gardens, I'm going to draw your attention to 8 qualities that comprise the Victorian era ideal of womanhood. And I would say that this is by no means comprehensive or exclusive, this list, but I do think there are 8 revealing qualities that apparently comprise the ideal woman. So, to turn then to the text. Of Queens Gardens was originally delivered as a lecture in Manchester in 1864. John Ruskin wrote it up and published it the next year in 1865 under the classification Lilies in their work Sesame and Lilies. Now, it was published, as I've said, in 1865, and it was incredibly popular, really very popular, and you can see this because it was in its 10th edition by 1889, so that's less than 25 years later, less than a quarter of a century later, and it had already gone through 10 editions. And Ruskin chose as the lecture's epigraph, so its motto, a quotation, as you can see at the bottom there, from Canticles 2:2, or the Song of Solomon, and the quotation translates as the lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters. So what the quotation really is saying here, as the lily among thorns, so is my love among the daughters, that, in other words, like a lily among thorns, so is the ideal woman among other women. And all women should strive likewise to be lilies rather than thorns. And you can see the symbolism here, obviously. Lilies are beautiful, delicate, and pleasing. Thorns are ugly, robust, and sharp. In the text, John Ruskin accepts and promotes the idea of separate spheres. That is, a separate sphere for men and a separate sphere for women, because man and woman are apparently innately, fundamentally different. Ruskin claims that neither sex is superior. But let us see the pressures and demands that he expects, and others more broadly too, the kind of person within society that Ruskin represents, that the ideal Victorian era woman was expected to adhere to. And despite claiming that neither sex is superior, let's see if we can see that there is an implicit and implied hierarchy within the way that he describes the separate spheres between man and woman and the kind of innate characteristics apparently of men and women. So this section of the text opens, "We are foolish, and without excuse foolish, in speaking of the superiority of one sex to the other, as if they could be compared in similar things. Each has what the other has not. Each completes the other, and is completed by the other. They are nothing alike." Men and women are, according to Ruskin, in nothing alike. So we can see here from the beginning of this section, the setting up of binary or polar opposites. So whatever man is, woman is not. If man is strong, then we can assume, kind of by implication, that woman is weak, because he's set up this notion that men and women are in nothing alike. So if you describe anything, if you give any characteristics to one, then the other must sort of automatically take on the opposite characteristics. And that's quite revealing then if we look at the way that men are described. And Ruskin begins by talking about man's characteristics. And what that also does, interestingly, is set up the woman as the opposite kind of creature. If you start with one and you say, I'm starting with that and the other is opposite to that, you've already set up this idea that the first thing is the kind of stable central thing, and the other thing that you're describing then is the opposite, or the other, or the reverse, or the negative, or all those kinds of associations to the main kind of principal, correct, right, primary thing. So it's just interesting, I think, to kind of notice that in terms of the structure of Ruskin's essay. But to continue then just with this section, and the happiness and perfection of both depends on each asking and receiving from the other what the other only can give. Of course, this is entirely heteronormative, and that means heteronormative means that it promotes heterosexuality as the kind of only way to be. And I don't just mean in terms of rather than homosexuality, but also not being single, that you can't be an individual either. And that if you want to be happy and perfect, or as, you know, and I think here perfect means kind of as good as you can be, that you have to have a partner of the opposite sex. So you cannot be happy and complete if you are single, is the implication here, because you are not complete without the other sex. Each completes the other and is completed by the other. So you're not a whole person unless you are in a heterosexual relationship, because you can only be completed by somebody of the opposite sex. Now, their separate characters, so the separate characters of men and women, are briefly these. So woman has kind of innately a separate character from man. This is inherent and absolute. Ruskin starts by describing man, as I've said, and his separate character. And they're briefly these. And this is the very first thing that he mentioned, and it's absolutely crucial. And it is point number one. It is the first Victorian era ideal of womanhood. And let's see what it is. The man's power is active. The man's power is active. So if we go back to our idea where he said men and women are in nothing alike, what does that lead us to understand about what women are? Therefore, the man's power is active. So by logic, then, the woman's power is passive. Passivity and acquiescence to man's active energy. That is, number one, the first Victorian era ideal of womanhood, according to Ruskin. So the man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. And again, going back to our idea of binary opposites, what this implies, of course, therefore, is that woman must be conversely, if man is the doer, woman must be passive. We've already established that. If he is the creator, then woman must be the follower. If he is the discoverer, then woman is incurious. And if he is the defender, then woman is what is defended. So we can see that already Ruskin is giving us a good picture of what he expects the ideal woman to be, even though he hasn't actually mentioned women yet. He's only mentioned man's power. So his intellect is for speculation and invention. His energy for adventure, for war, and for conquest. Therefore, of course, women's energy implicitly is for, if his is for adventure, then hers is for cautiousness or lack of experience. If his is for war, then hers is for peace. If his is for conquest, then hers is for surrender or acquiescence. And now Ruskin moves on to talk about woman's power. So what is woman's power? But the woman's power is for rule, not for battle. Well, okay, that sounds like woman does have some power there. Woman's power is for rule. Now, we might remember, of course, that this is the Victorian era. Queen Victoria was, of course, ruler. She was on the throne at the time. So it's unsurprising that women could be thought fit to rule. Indeed, you might say that they had to be described fit to rule, because if you said women were not fit to rule, then you would be committing treason. You'd be essentially saying that Queen Victoria wasn't fit to rule. So women are allowed to rule, okay, but what do they rule and how should they rule? Ruskin goes on to explain and to kind of set up the answers to these questions. And as a note, even though she was queen and therefore ruler, of course, Victoria came to represent a kind of domesticity and femininity that centred on the home, on the family, on wifeliness and respectability. Symbolically, Queen Victoria was more mother of the nation than power player in politics. Ruskin continues, her intellect is not for invention or creation, as man's intellect was, but for sweet ordering, arrangement and decision. And that sweet there is so patronising. It's really unnecessary addition there. It doesn't need to be there at all. He could simply have said, but for ordering, arrangement and decision. But no, it's kind of diminishing her intellect, I would suggest, by including the word sweet there, for sweet ordering and arrangement. As though she couldn't, her intellect is not for anything hard or anything brutal. No, it's for sweet things. So also here, if his intellect is for invention and creation, her intellect is described as being for ordering and arrangement. And there's a real subtle, you could say, curtailing of this kind of scope and freedom that that women's intellect is a kind of allowed to inhabit here. Women can only order and arrange what is already there. So invention and creation, man's separate character, are about freedom and doing something new or unthought of before, going to new territories, pushing the boundaries. Invention, by its very kind of definition, that means doing something that has not been done before, the spirit of adventure and so on, as Ruskin describes man's character. But by saying that woman is for or fit for ordering and arrangement, all you can order and arrange is what is already within your sphere. So you take what you're given and you decide what order it goes in or where it's supposed to be. Yes, that's a kind of power, but there's not much choice about or there's not necessarily any choice about what you get to order or arrange. That you order and arrange what is put in front of you. You don't get to invent something new for yourself. Ruskin's word decision here, I think, is also interesting. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines decision as the action, fact or process of deciding or bringing to an end a contest, controversy, etc. Judgment with regard to a matter in dispute, settlement, resolution. the action, fact, or process of arriving at a conclusion regarding a matter under consideration. And again, decision, although on the one hand you might say, well, Ruskin thinks that women are allowed to make decisions. Well, that's a kind of freedom, and yes, it is a kind of freedom, but according to the definition here, we see that this is kind of a use of intellect that's to do with judgment about the matter under consideration in front of you. So if a judge makes a decision, the only decisions the judge can make are those about the kind of trial that's going on in front of him or her. The other crucial word here, I think, is resolution. So, and we'll get on to see why this matters a bit later. But again, this is a kind of intellect which is to do with saying, these are the options, decide which you're going to choose. It's not about thinking new, innovative thoughts. It's about resolving an issue between, A and B, bringing to an end a contest. In other words, it's not unfettered free thinking, but coming to a resolution about the matter under consideration. Like ordering and arranging, it's a sense of women having a limited or circumscribed scope about which they are able to exert their intellect over. She can deal with what is put in front of her, but she cannot innovate, cannot do something new, cannot create for herself. And I think this is the second Victorian era ideal of womanhood that is presented to us by John Ruskin, which is that woman is reactive rather than proactive. And the text continues, she sees the qualities of things, their claims and their places. And now we have the third Victorian era ideal of womanhood presented by Ruskin, and it's a humdinger. Her great function is praise. Her great function is praise with a capital P. So there are many things to note here, but her great function, meaning her sort of primary function, her biggest function is praise. And the word function there, so what Ruskin seems to be implying basically is that women's primary purpose is to praise men, essentially. That is woman's purpose, that is her job. It is to praise. Not to critique or to, dissect or to intellectually engage with. No. Her great function is praise. She enters into no contest. So she's not actually allowed to be in the fight itself or in the intellectual engagement or whatever. She's not allowed to go into the contest. She can only praise. And infallibly adjudges the crown of the contest. So she can choose who wins the contest. She can make a decision about that, going back to the idea of decision. And she can praise the best competitor and so on, but she can't be in the competition herself. And also, there's an interesting kind of choice of diction here. Infallibly adjudges. This idea that she must not be wrong. By her office and place, she is protected from all danger and temptation. And here is the classic Fall of Eve stuff. Woman cannot be trusted not to fall into temptation. So she must be protected from all danger and temptation. And her office, so her place in the home, angel in the house, protect her from temptation, because obviously she can't be trusted not to fall into temptation herself. The man in his rough work in the open world. And again, going back to the idea of binaries, so the man in his rough work, which implies, of course, that woman should be smooth, so shouldn't be rough. In the open world, which again implies, therefore, that woman's sphere ought to be in a closed world, so to be smooth and to be closed rather than to be rough and to be open, must encounter all peril and trial. To him, therefore, the failure, the offence, the inevitable error Often he must be wounded or subdued, often misled, and always hardened. But he guards the woman from all this. What does the man guard the woman from? The list implies that she should not fail, that she should not cause offence, she should not err, and she must never be hardened. And so, she should be soft. If the man is going out into the rough, open world and is always hardened, then woman should stay in a closed, smooth world and never be hardened. Now, one of the things that is not really thought through here in terms of the logical argument is that he goes out into the world and he must fail and he must encounter offence and he must err sometimes, he must be in error sometimes, and he might be wounded or subdued or misled, etc. So he can fall into all those things can happen to him, and yet somehow he is going to guard woman from all of that. So he can't guard himself from all of that, but he can guard woman from all of that. The logic of that argument doesn't really make any sense. If he can go out into the world and cope with all those things, then why shouldn't women go out into the world and cope with all those things? But no, even though he can't protect himself from those things, he is going to guard her from all this. How? By keeping her within his house. Within his house, note, as ruled by her. So it's still his house, even if she ostensibly rules in it. That's a kind of odd conception there. It doesn't really make any logical sense. If she ruled, then surely it would be her house. So clearly she doesn't rule. She's subordinate. Even in her ruling, she's still subordinate in his house. So he guards her from all this, from within his house, unless she herself has sought it. So unless she has sought any of these things, there need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error or offence. So it is her fault if danger, temptation, error or offence enters the house. These will only enter into the house if she has sought them herself. So it's her fault if anything goes wrong. This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace. And here we have the fourth Victorian era ideal of womanhood presented by Ruskin, which is that woman is the keeper of the peace. That she mustn't enter into the contest herself, as it said previously, but she maintains a place of peace. Not allowed to raise any concerns or cause any offence or worry about any errors or anything like that. No. She must keep the peace. That's another of her functions. So the shelter not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt and division. That's what the home is, the true nature of home. So what's implicit here, what's implied here, is that a woman must not doubt or show division from her man, and that's part of her role as keeper of the peace. And Ruskin continues, in so far as it is not this, it is not home. So far as the anxieties of the outer life penetrate into it, and the inconsistently minded, unknown, unloved, or hostile society of the outer world is allowed by either husband or wife to cross the threshold, it ceases to be home. So the public world, the outside world, the real world, you might say, as soon as the anxieties of that, the outer world, cross the threshold, home is no longer home. So it's the kind of woman's job to keep all the anxieties of the outside world out of the home and to keep the peace. Home must not be penetrated. It's an interesting choice of word there. If you think of the outside world as masculine and the home as feminine, the home must not be penetrated by the anxieties of the outer life. What does this really mean? It means that a woman's place then is really detached from the outside world, from the real world. And this is presented, you could say, as being a good thing, as it means that woman is removed from anxiety. And who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to be removed from anxiety? But it also means that the broader concerns of the outside world, of public life, so politics or a career or debate or social concerns or anything at all to do with public life, to do with engagement in the world, is completely kind of beyond her scope. And if any of that crosses the threshold at all, then the environment that she has created ceases to be home. And one of the sad things I think about this is that it really suggests that husband and wife should not discuss matters relating to outer life at all. And surely that means that they're incredibly, or encourages them to be incredibly kind of detached from each other. If you have many anxieties in, I don't know, your career, or, you know, if you're a husband and you have worries about what's going on, and you can't even sort of talk about them within the home, because that's kind of destroying this apparent kind of bastion of peace that your wife has created. That's going to create two kind of lives that are totally detached and totally removed from each other. And I think that's sad. So if you allow those anxieties to cross the threshold, then home is only a part of that outer world which you have roofed over and lighted fire in. So if you allow the outside world in, it's no longer a home, it's just where you go to have a roof over your head and have a fire, keep you warm. But so far as it is a sacred place, a vestal temple, a temple of the hearth, watched over by household gods, before whose faces none may come but those whom they can receive with love. And here we have the kind of Victorian language, I suppose, of the domestic goddess, as it's been called more recently. Or we might say the angel in the house. Divine, saintly figure. And you can see that from John Ruskin's use of religious diction and imagery here. We have the word sacred and the word temple. So home then is presented as almost a kind of religious, spiritual place, like a temple. So it's not your kind of most human place, but it's a place that's supposed to be kind of treated with a sort of divine reverence, Ruskin seems to be suggesting. And his use of household gods again is interesting, putting the home on a kind of divine plane. And here, and the use of Vestal and the use of household gods refers, I think, to Vesta. Vesta is from Roman mythology. She's the virgin goddess of the hearth. She corresponds to the Greek goddess Hestia. So she's symbolic of the hearth, of home, and of family. She was custodian of the sacred fire brought by Aeneas from Troy, which she must ensure never went out, otherwise calamity would follow. So essentially, she must keep the warmth of the fireside hearth alight always. Vesta was thought of as a virgin, and her followers came, the Vestal virgins, her followers came to represent sort of sexual purity and chasteness. And that's interesting here, I think, because there's an implication that women should not be sexually wanton even within marriage, that a wife should embody that kind of spiritual chasteness, we might call it, or sort of spiritual purity. And in some sense here, the symbolism goes further and sort of suggests that the home itself is like a Vestal virgin and should not be ruined or spoiled or penetrated by the masculine outside world. Ruskin then goes on to describe, so he'd earlier said that you don't want your home to be a place which is only a roof over your head and only a fire in the hearth, so that the shade and light. And the shade of the roof and the light of the fire. And he brings back that imagery here. So far as home is this, that is this sacred place, this vestal temple, and roof and fire are types only of a nobler shade and light. So I'm now going to mention, so they're not just a roof of your head, that kind of shade, and the light of the fire, but they have a broader symbolism to them, which is shade as of the rock in a weary land. And this is a quotation from Isaiah, from the Bible. This is the King James Version, chapter 32, verse 2, which reads, "And a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest." So that means a shelter from the tempest. "As rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land." Or as Ruskin has it, the shade of the rock in a weary land. Weary here meaning parched, desert-like, hot. So it's the shade of the home should be like the shade provided by a big rock in a kind of dry, arid land. That shade is sort of essential for maintaining life. The shade here is sort of representative more broadly of the man offering fundamental necessary shade and protection. So that's the symbolism of the shade. The symbolism of the light then comes in, and the light as of the pharos in the stormy sea. So the pharos here refers to the lighthouse of Alexandria, which was built on the island of Pharos, and it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So man provides shade from harm, and woman is a beacon of light, is a beacon of hope, is a wonder of the world. The symbolism of the illusions then are that man's role is sanctified by the Bible, and woman should be viewed as a kind of wonder of the world. So far as it vindicates, justifies the name and fulfills the praise of home. So what's interesting here is that home is presented kind of as being far, far more than just a roof over your head and a fire in the fireplace, which of course it is, but it's taken on kind of biblical and mythological status in alluding to the Bible and in alluding to one of the wonders of the ancient world. So the home is not ordinary or everyday, it's elevated to this kind of divine mythological level, and only then does it vindicate, justify the name, fulfills the praise of home. So this idea of sort of the ordinary not being acceptable and having to go up to a kind of extraordinary level comes into play when we think about the Victorian ideal of womanhood that comes in particularly here. And this is the 5th Victorian era ideal of womanhood as presented by John Ruskin. And it's to do with the presentation of woman and home and the symbolism of woman and the home, which is that woman was associated with the home, angel in the house, but not just as a physical dwelling, but home as a sort of concept. So, and wherever a true wife comes, this home is always around her. So it's almost not just kept within the dwelling place of the home, but home is a set of kind of symbols and a set of things which woman has to carry around with her, even if she does actually venture out of the house. There are a set of sort of characteristics that she's supposed to embody, including keeping the peace. So home is supposed to be a kind of peaceful place, yes, but symbolically she, the woman, is supposed to kind of carry that around with her wherever she goes. A true wife, wherever a true wife comes, this home is always around her. The stars only may be over her head, so she might not even have a roof over her head. The glowworm in the night-cold grass may be the only fire at her foot, so she might not have a fire in a fireplace, going back to the idea of shade and light. But home is yet wherever she is. So the idea of home as a kind of concept, or you might say a kind of burden for the woman to carry around with her wherever she goes. And for a noble woman, it stretches far around her. So it's not just close, it's not just to do with her herself, but it stretches far. So she's supposed to kind of project it as far as she can. Better than sealed, roofed with cedar, a type of tree, or painted with vermilion, which is red. And this is another allusion to the Bible, this time to Jeremiah, chapter 22, verse 13 to 14. And it reads, "Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbour's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work. That saith, I will build me a wide house and large chambers, and cutteth him out windows, and it is sealed with cedar and painted with vermilion." And the kind of implication here is that women should not sit idly and sort of in selfish and indulgent luxury. So the house that is described here is a wide house with large chambers. So it's a big, grand, luxurious house that's sealed with, that's got a roof of cedar and is painted in this beautiful vermilion red colour. Luxurious colours is the implication. So that woman should not kind of contain herself to this luxurious home of sumptuous excess, you might say, but instead create a home of righteousness. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness. So these sort of symbolic qualities of home, the ideal Victorian woman, are more important in creating a comfortable home than kind of luxury. So home is yet wherever she is, and better than luxury, shedding its quiet light far for those who else were homeless. Again, shedding her light far. She's this beacon of light, beacon of hope, and it's her duty to kind of project that out as much and as far as she can. She's a beacon of quiet light, so she's not allowed to be kind of loud and showy with her light. She's got to be quiet with her light. She can't escape really the concept of home. Even when she's stepped out from her front door, she's still got to embody and symbolise these qualities, and furthermore she's got to project them out quietly as far as she can, kind of into the world. She's got to be this lighthouse. And when you think of lighthouses, they're kind of stationary, and they beam out and warn others. The others out at sea are kind of doing the action, and the lighthouse is stationary and really passive. And that's the kind of symbolism that Ruskin is going with here. This then I believe to be, will you not admit it to be, the woman's true place and power. And I think it's an interesting use of the word power here, an interesting choice of word. What exactly is woman's power? Her power is to be a symbol. And I would suggest that that's not really power. Woman has the power to symbolise what man has decreed it is that she symbolises. And the kind of weight of that symbolism is laid very, very heavily, as we'll go on to see. But do you not see that to fulfil this, she must, as far as one can use such terms of a human creature, but still, she must be incapable of error. So to have any power at all, her power is in the symbolism of the home, but it's got to be a perfect, she's got to be a perfect representation, a perfect symbol of home. She must be incapable of error. So the man can go out into with his rough work in the outer world, can go out, and of course he's going to fall into error, of course. But she must be incapable of error. That's such a burden. It's such a burden, this kind of symbol of light and hope and home, etc. And she must never, ever, ever err from it. She must never be wrong. She must be perfect. And here I think we have the sixth Victorian era ideal of womanhood, which is that anything less than perfect is not good enough. That you have failed if you do not kind of embody, not only at home, but at all times, far and wide, if you do not embody perfection. So far as she rules. So earlier it said, she has an intellect capable for rule, not for battle. But this is a limited sphere that she is permitted to rule over, as far as she rules. So it's only qualified ruling then. As far as she rules, all must be right or nothing is. So if there's any error at all, if there's any kind of crack, then it's all, then it's nothing. The whole image of home, apparently, will come crashing down if the woman is not perfect, even for a trifling moment. And it goes on, and it's almost laughable. She must be enduringly, incorruptibly good, instinctively, infallibly wise. Wise not for self-development, but for self-renunciation. And absolutely, this is a very important, if you want to understand kind of Victorian culture about women and women's role. It's the seventh Victorian era ideal of womanhood as presented by Ruskin. It's self-renunciation. So a woman's purpose is not self-development, not learning or improvement or growing, etc. No, the Oxford English Dictionary defines self-renunciation as the renunciation, meaning the giving up or the forsaking of one's own desires, interests, needs, etc. So a woman's purpose is self-renunciation, is to give up, forsake her own desires and her own needs, especially as a religious duty, self-sacrifice, self-denial. This is good and wise for woman to do. Wise, not that she may set herself above, heaven forfend that a woman might seek to be above her husband in some way. Not that she may set herself above her husband, but that she may never fail from his side. Wise not with the narrowness of insolent and loveless pride, but with the passionate gentleness of an infinitely variable, because infinitely applicable, modesty of service, the true changefulness of woman. So a woman should be gentle, modest, and above all, be in service to her husband, to attend to his needs, his wants, and his desires. She has to be infinitely adaptable because she has to service whatever it is that he needs and what his needs happen to be. And that is the true changefulness of woman, Ruskin argues. Here we have the eighth, the final, although as I've said, this list is by no means complete, but another Victorian era ideal of womanhood, which is that woman's role is a role of service, performed with gentleness and modesty, and that woman should be infinitely adaptable to others' needs whilst renouncing her own needs. So how does Ruskin then take this idea of the changefulness of woman and present it as being a good thing? So in that great sense, and earlier it was that, women's great function was praise. So here it's sort of seemingly elevating women, and yet in that great sense, la donna è mobile, so that means woman is changeable. So the woman is changeable, not qual piem al vento, so not like a feather in the wind. So she's not that kind of changeable, because that's often a criticism levelled at women, that they're sort of flibbertigibbets and they can't make their mind up, and they just, you know, their mind changes as easily as a feather will be blown in the wind. But Ruskin is saying, no, that is not the kind of beauty of the changefulness of woman. No, nor yet variable as the shade by the light quivering aspen made. Aspen is a type of tree. So again, we're bringing back the symbolism of the shade and the light. The noble shade and light, which I mentioned earlier. And this quotation is from Sir Walter Scott's poem Marmion, which was published in 1808. And that was also a very, 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 very popular poem. And this quotation is from Canto 6, stanza 30, and it reads, "O woman, in our hours of ease, uncertain, coy, and hard to please, and variable as the shade by the light quivering aspen made, when pain and anguish wring the brow, a ministering angel thou." So in quoting these lines of Scott's, John Ruskin is suggesting that women should not, no, nor yet, he writes, be variable as the shadows cast by a tree waving in the wind. That is, uncertain, coy, and hard to please one moment, and a ministering angel in another moment. But instead, consistently in all moments, woman should be certain, in the sense of sure of her convictions, not coy. Coy here meaning coquettish or provocatively flirtatious, but also coy meaning deliberately holding something back or deliberately deceptive. So woman should not be coy in those senses, and she should be easy rather than hard to please, as well, of course, as being a ministering angel. Ministering meaning attending to the needs of somebody else. Again here in Scott's Marmion, as in Coventry Patmore's The Angel in the House, we see the promotion of the 19th century notion of the proper woman as an angel. We should think, perhaps, not only of the Victorian era ideal of womanhood, but also that in the Victorian era, a woman ought to be ideal. Anything less than ideal, and a woman was not a proper woman. So there was a conflation of the ideal and the ordinary. The ordinary woman, in other words, is supposed to be ideal. If you are anything less than ideal, then you had failed entirely, remember, then you are nothing. If you are anything less than ideal, then you had failed in your duty as a woman. And that's one of the things I hope you'll take away from the lecture today, is this conflation really between ideal and ordinary. So we talk about Victorian era ideals of womanhood, but they were not just ideals, they were expected. So returning to this image of light then, woman shouldn't be variable as light as it appears through the trees waving in the breeze, not that kind of light which comes up and goes down and there's shadow and there's a moment of light, etc. But variable as the light, manifold in fair and serene division. Again, we've got this sort of angelic idea, serene. But I would also just draw your attention to this kind of continued use of the symbolism of light, and how Ruskin closes this section using this imagery of light. And you'll notice here that in this final section, light has been italicized, really to emphasize the symbolism of the light, that it may take the colour of all that it falls upon and exalt it. And this is kind of fundamental to the passivity, I suppose, that's implicit in the ideal of womanhood as presented by Ruskin. Women should be receptive to kind of all her husband's needs and desires, etc. Any shade, any colour he might choose to need or desire, she has to be kind of adaptable to it. And as light shines on any colour, she has to exalt it. And exalt here means praise, kind of raise up. We're back to the fundamental function, the great function of woman, as Ruskin said earlier, which is praise. So light falls on anything, and when you catch something in the right light and it's kind of illuminated and it just looks kind of beautiful, it looks gorgeous. Any colour really looks gorgeous when the light shines on it in a particular way. Those colours are kind of exalted by the light falling on them, and that is the woman's role to her husband. Again, although perhaps this is seemingly kind of glorious and majestic, the power that is given to woman by describing her as light, I would argue that you can see it as a passive kind of power. She only has the power to exalt what her light happens to fall upon. She does not have the power or agency to build or create what is there. At most, I would suggest she has only a secondary power. I'm just going to close by reiterating the 8 Victorian era ideals of womanhood that I think are shown in John Ruskin's very influential account of how a woman ought to be. And there are only 8 here. As I said earlier, the list is not exhaustive, but I do think they give a good insight into, if you're interested in Victorian culture and understanding the pressure, the immense pressure on women to be this ideal of womanhood. Any flaw at all, and you were no longer you didn't even really qualify as woman. It's just kind of crazy, really, to look back on it now. But at the same time, many, I think, of these characteristics are still, perhaps not to the same extent, but are still more expected in women than in men. So to go through them again. Number 1, woman was passive and acquiescent, and woman has a passive and acquiescent energy compared to man's active energy. 2, woman is reactive rather than proactive. She can order and arrange what is already there, but only men somehow can create something new. And of course it's stereotypical, but if we think about big businesses, generally speaking, men are at the top of those big innovative businesses, but in a career something like a PA, generally that's dominated by women. Again, that's obviously a complete generalisation, but I use it to kind of show that there's still a hangover, I think, from these apparently Victorian ideals of womanhood that perhaps still persist, perhaps unconsciously to some extent. So number 3, woman's great function is praise. 4, woman is keeper of the peace. 5, woman and home are synonymous concepts. Home is a symbol as well as a real place, and woman must keep the idea of home around her at all times and spread it as far and wide as she possibly can. 6, a woman cannot err. She must be perfect, or else she fails as a proper woman. 7, woman's goodness and wisdom is in self-renunciation. 8, woman's role is a role of service to her home, to her husband. I really hope that you found it interesting to go through this text and think about the pressures and the ludicrousness, really, of the extent that perfection was expected in women in the Victorian period, at least symbolically in these texts. It's interesting to look at, even as it might be infuriating. But I think it's revealing. It shows us a lot, I think, still about our own our own society, to be frank. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe, and if you have liked the video, then do please press the like button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And do put your thoughts below. How do you interpret Ruskin's text? And do you think that perhaps any of these Victorian era ideals of womanhood continue to persist?